Welcome to our next part of Early Latin morphosyntax. It is now time to move on to subordination in Latin. Before we can do so, we need to talk about the distinction between indicative and subjunctive. Indo-European had an indicative, a subjunctive, an optative, an imperative, and presumably also an injunctive. We can ignore the imperative here, and also the injunctive, as it's mainly relevant for Sanskrit. The Indo-European subjunctives yielded Latin futures such as ero, eris, erit, while the Indo-European optatives turned into our Latin subjunctives such as siem, sies, siet, and so on. Much has been written about the meanings of the various Indo-European moods, and there's not much point in discussing this literature here. For our purposes, it's more relevant to look at the types of modality found across languages. Every language has means, lexical or grammatical, to express three types of modality: root modality, epistemic modality, and deontic modality. A root modality is concerned with ability and similar concepts. It's most commonly expressed by lexical means, as it is in Latin, where we have modal verbs like posse, or in English, where we have modal verbs like can, be able to, so as in Tom can make it on time because he has a car, which is root modality. We also find epistemic modality, which is about the reality status of an event, such as Tom may make it on time if he rushes. And finally, deontic modality, which is about obligations and similar concepts, such as Tom has to make it on time or there will be trouble. Let's begin with epistemic modality. Epistemic modality tells us whether an event is likely, possible, and so on. In Latin main clauses, the indicative presents an event as real, while a subjunctive can express epistemic modality and indicate that an event might happen or that it cannot happen. In such cases, traditional grammars speak of potential and unreal subjunctives. There's a very clear interaction between tense and mood here. For present potential, we most commonly use a present subjunctive, or sometimes a perfect subjunctive, to indicate that something is only possible rather than happening without doubt. But for a counterfactual statement referring to the present moment, we need the imperfect subjunctive. The past tense indicates a further step away from the reality expressed by a present indicative. So let's look at two examples. My first one, for a potential subjunctive, comes from classical Latin, from Cicero, where someone says, si ac rona relictus sim, non quam dicere, if I were deserted, perfect subjunctive, by my crowd, by my audience, I might not be able to speak again, present subjunctive. He presents it as a distinct possibility, but not necessarily as something that has to happen. Now, in early Latin you find that same kind of construction, but we also find unreal subjunctives. And as I said, in classical Latin and also in early Latin, it's mostly done by using an imperfect subjunctive for present unreal conditions. So, unreal subjunctive, counterfactual, opposite of reality. I'm giving you an example here from Plautus, from the Pseudolus. Si graderere tantum quantum loquere, jam esses ad forum. If you were to walk, but you're not walking, as quickly as you talk, or as much as you talk, imperfect subjunctive, you would already be at the market, but you're not. Imperfect subjunctive, again, indicating present counterfactual. Now that is really the most common situation in early Latin, but in early Latin it has to be said the distinction between potential and unreal is not yet as fully developed as in classical Latin. On occasion, Plautus still uses a present subjunctive for events which are very clearly counterfactual and not potential, as you can see here. Hoc si ita fiat, if it were to happen like that, present subjunctive, but it's not happening like that, so it's counterfactual. Mores meliores sibi parent, they would acquire better manners for themselves. Again, present subjunctive, but it's counterfactual because they're not doing that. Let's move on to deontic modality. Deontic modality is by its very nature counterfactual. It tells us whether a state of affairs which hasn't become true yet must or should happen. Again, the subjunctive can be used in this function in Latin. Traditional grammars speak of jussive subjunctives. In classical Latin, that is most common in the third person, and for the second person you take the imperative. The imperative in classical Latin is preferred to such an extent that some grammars try to explain away any instances of this second person jussive subjunctive. So we get, for example, in classical Latin things like abeat, valeat, third person present subjunctive, let him go away, let her be happy. And these are also perfectly fine in early Latin, but in classical Latin, for second persons, you prefer an imperative. In early Latin, on the other hand, the second person present subjunctive can commonly be used instead of an imperative, as you can see here on my slide. Valeas, may you be well, may you be happy. Well, in this case, may you be well. Tibi habeas, res tuas, have your things for yourself. Redas meas, and return mine to me. So valeas could perhaps be interpreted as a wish, but the other things are very clearly commands. We are dealing here with the ancient divorce formula. Take your stuff and return mine. Let's move on to grammaticalization. Grammaticalization means that a lexical item turns into a grammatical function word, or that a grammatical morpheme has its meaning bleached out and becomes what we call more grammatical. I have mentioned that many Latin prepositions go back to nouns. We see similar things in English. We have here, I'm going to fetch water, which could just be motion, but it's ambiguous. It can be interpreted as future tense. I'm going to fetch water, I will fetch water. So it is an ambiguous construction. It could be motion or future. It has been reanalyzed as a future marker. And if we now say, I'm going to stay here, this can't imply any motion. It has become a pure future tense. Similarly, we have a noun while, a while, meaning a short span of time, which can grammaticalize and turn into a temporal subordinator. I'm reading while John is singing, or into a concessive, I'm bright while John is a bit dim. So we can see grammaticalization happens in all languages, and we can find a similar phenomenon with the Latin subjunctive. In main clauses, the subjunctive is always meaningful. It expresses epistemic or deontic modality. But in subordinate clauses, that's not always the case. An ut clause, when final, in order to, does indeed still express deontic modality. But when that ut clause is consecutive and means so that, it is purely factual, and one might expect an indicative. Yet it is the subjunctive which has to be used and is completely obligatory. So you can see that quite nicely here. We have three types of ut. Ut te omnes demifo di perduint, a main clause, ut, plus subjunctive indicating a wish. It has a clear grammatical function, it has a clear meaning. May all the gods destroy you, demifo. Here we have, in my next example, a proper final clause, where we can still see some sort of a deontic modality. So we have one person asking, Nam quor me miseram verberas? Why are you hitting me, wretched person that I am? And the person doing the hitting says, ut misera sis, so that you are a wretch, in order that you are a wretch. It's very clearly intentional. We have deontic modality and we get a subjunctive. And then finally, we can have again a subjunctive, but without any kind of deontic or epistemic meaning. It's completely grammaticalized. It's a factual statement. So we have a main clause, omnibus amicis morbum tu incuties gravem. You are causing grave concern to all your friends. Ut, so that they're unhappy, aigroti sient, to see you and hear you. In this case, the subjunctive is purely grammaticalized. It cannot be predicted from the semantics of the clause. So here we have to basically learn what sort of mood we use in which subordinate clause type. English has a phenomenon called backshift of tenses. If I have a verb like to say in a main clause, the tense of the subordinate clause is partly dependent on the tense of the main clause. So, for example, if I say John says, present tense, the subordinate clause can have different tenses. He is going to read, prospective, he is reading, present progressive, and he has read, perfect, the book. If I turn that into a past tense, John said, I get backshift of tenses, and so we now get he was going to read, he was reading, and he had read. So a very clear backshift of tenses. For example, the going to turns into was going to, the is reading turns into was reading, and has read turns into a pluperfect had read. A similar phenomenon happens in Latin. Let's look at a main clause and an indirect question. The indirect question can be anterior in time to the main clause. It can happen at the same time, or it can be posterior. If the main clause is in a non-past tense, the subjunctival subordinate clause will be in the perfect, the present, or the periphrastic future. So, for example, present tense main clause, so a non-past tense, rogo te, I'm asking you. What you have said, perfect. Dixeris, what you are saying, present. Dicas, or what you are going to say, posterior subjunctive, dicturus sis. If the main clause verb is in a past tense, rogabam, I asked you, we have backshift of tenses. We get dixisses, pluperfect, what you had said, diceres, imperfect subjunctive, what you were saying, and dicturus essis, what you were going to say. Essentially then, subordinate clauses can mark relative tenses, such as anterior, simultaneous, and posterior. But subordinate clauses will take their absolute past or non-past feature from the main clause. The main difference between early and classical Latin in this regard is that in the early period, posteriority is often expressed to present or imperfect subjunctives. So essentially, the forms in urus have not yet become obligatory. Let's look at subordinate clause types in Latin. Latin has three main types of finite subordinate clauses. We get relative clauses, introduced by simple pronouns, by relative pronouns, such as qui. We get indirect questions, providing some kind of indirect speech, introduced by cognate pronouns, question pronouns, such as quis. And we get a third type, adverbial clauses, with a variety of subordinators and semantic functions, but quite commonly the subordinators introducing such adverbial clauses are etymologically related, such as quam or cum. So what you can see here is each of these begins with a QU, a labiovelar, indicating they all go back to a similar paradigm. Let's now look at moods and relative clauses. The moods and relative clauses are pretty straightforward in early Latin. We can make a distinction between defining and non-defining relative clauses. And in defining relative clauses, the indicative is normal. So a made-up example, video puellam quae Latine loquitur. I can see a girl, quae, who, speaks Latin, indicative. In defining relative clauses, I can also use a subjunctive, but that indicates that the noun modified is indefinite and specific. So, quaero puellam, I'm looking for a girl. Quae, relative pronoun, Latine loquatur, who speaks Latin, a girl of the type who is able to speak Latin. In non-defining relative clauses, the indicative is again normal, and again I've just made an example because there's not much point. Most relative clauses are of this type. Video Marcum, I can see Mark. Qui est, indicative, amicus meus. But the subjunctive can be used to indicate there's a further meaning, and that can be causal or concessive or anything else. And this meaning you have to infer from context. So for example in Plautus, in the Miles, we find a passage where a flatterer says to his boss, amantet omnes mulieres, neque injuria, so all women love you, and quite rightly so. Qui sis tam pulcher, you who are so beautiful, or because you are so beautiful. So clearly a causal element here. Let's move on to indirect questions. Indirect questions in classical Latin typically have the subjunctive, and here's a nice example from Horace. Vides ut alta stet nive candidum soracte. You can see how Mount Soracte is white, stands white, covered in deep snow. We have ut, indicating an indirect question, and we have stet as a present subjunctive. Now, in classical Latin, the subjunctive in indirect questions is normal. There are some exceptions, but by and large, that's what you expect. Prehistorically, before Plautus, the indicative probably was normal, and in Plautus and Terence, you can find both moods. The subjunctive already predominates statistically, but the indicative is much more common than in the classical period. So, for example, again from the Miles Gloriosus by Plautus, the same situation, someone is flattering his boss. He says, vide Caesaries quam decet, quam being a subordinator and decet being an indicative. Look how his full head of hair suits him. So again, clear flattery here in an indicative. Adverbial clauses come in different types. Some, like ut clauses, are always in the subjunctive. In others, we find a meaningful choice between moods, and in others we can find interesting diachronic developments. And I'm going to give you one example here. In cum clauses, we normally learn, for classical Latin, that the subjunctive has to be used when cum means because or even though. And the indicative is used when it means when. Well, obviously, one single subordinator cannot have contradictory meanings like because and even though. Essentially, the basic meaning of cum is temporal, and it means when. In classical Latin, you use a subjunctive to indicate there is a further meaning, and it's up to the audience to figure out what that meaning may be from a broader context. Now, if you go back in time to Plautus and Terence, you can see that cum clauses are normally still in the indicative, however they are to be interpreted. A causal cum clause, a concessive cum clause, a temporal cum clause, you tend to simply use an indicative. Now, we can see that diachronic change quite nicely when we look at a passage from Plautus being misquoted by Cicero. So in Plautus we have praesagibat mi animus me frustra ire, quam ex ibam domo. I had a gut feeling that I was going to go in vain when I left the house. Quam plus indicative. Now that passage is quoted by Cicero in his De Divinatione in Book 1, where he quotes quite a lot of early Latin. But he quotes from memory rather than from a text edition, and so he misquotes it and says cum exirem subjunctive domo. So essentially, he adapts Plautine syntax to his own by mistake because he's quoting from memory. And that indicates quite nicely how diachronic developments can happen. That's it for finite subordinate clauses. Thank you very much for listening to me, and as we say in early Latin, vobis habeo gratias.